This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khannan.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, we have an incredible show today. We're going to be talking about the final admission, not a complete admission, but the apartheid state seems to have come to the conclusion that they murdered Palestinian American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. We're going to talk a little bit about that. They couched it in kind of their typical Hasbara language, but it seems like they're finally admitting that they murdered this Palestinian American journalist. We're also going to be talking about this crazy rule in the tradition of an apartheid regime. The Israeli Apartheid state had passed a law saying that Palestinians, including Americans, by the way, anybody visiting the West Bank would have to declare their love interest to the Israeli.
Can you believe this, Jess?
Well, we'll get to it. We're going to talk about the law that's been put on hold temporarily. We'll see what's going to happen. But the idea that they would do this is rather remarkable. It's never been done before by an apartheid state or even a non-apartheid state. This is truly remarkable. We're going to talk about this, but really our big story today is your interview with Kareem Dennis, otherwise known as Lowkey, an internationally renowned rapper committed to rapping and singing and writing about justice. One of the most extraordinary rappers around, who's been, by the way, viciously attacked by pro-Israel forces and the apartheid state, and despite those attacks has continued to make remarkable music, remarkable writing, and remarkable kind of a body of work consistent with like a real genuine commitment to justice. And your interview with him is really remarkable.
Lowkey is in the house, Jess. So let's listen to the interview with Lowkey. A lot to learn, much respect both for his music and his activism. I mean, this dude is on top of international affairs and social justice.
Free Palestine, free Palestine, free Palestine, free Palestine. If Ibrahim Abu Thuraya could resist without a wheelchair, 10-year challenge, tell Regeb we are still here. And tell that killer Netanyahu he should feel fear. The old live through us and guarantee the children will care. Criminal, not invincible, and you know it. Samadoun still sitting in their stoic. May not feel us with you when you listen to our poems. You inspire humanity, your resistance is heroic. Regardless of talk, here's time we answer the call. Through your strength of spirit you provide.
Israeli apartheid, the refugee tragedy across Europe, racism, the Grenfell Tower inferno. In his chart-topping raps, political activist, justice warrior, and of course rapper, Lowkey holds power accountable with compelling lyrics and heart-wrenching videos. Speaking truth to power is never without cost. One example is how Israel's lobbying network constantly works to censor Lowkey due to his criticism of Israeli apartheid and its oppression of Palestinian people. Using unfounded smears of anti-Semitism, they most recently tried to pressure Spotify to remove Lowkey's songs from its playlist. They've also pressured music venues and universities to cancel his appearances they had scheduled. But Lowkey will not be deterred. Lowkey is in the house today here on Arab Talk. First of all, I want to thank you for your unwavering dedication to continually call out justice wherever you see it, using what has become your impressive music platform. I'd like to start with you, Lowkey, Kareem Dennis, the man. You embraced activism at a very young age. Would you say that rapping and activism were always parallel passions for you?
Well, to start with, thank you very much, Jamal, for the very kind introduction. This is more than I deserve, I am sure. In terms of my own trajectory towards using music as a form of political mobilizing. I would say that as a young person growing up in London and seeing the community which I am from have several different problems that were linked to global problems. So, for example, you have the way the war on terror manifested in my community. Certain legislation that was passed along with the war on terror had particular effect on peers of mine and people around me. Also, the direct familial connection to the war on terror, insofar as one side of my family being from Iraq. That obviously then coming even further to the third example, which would be the Grenfell Tower fire, which happened next door to me, and a friend of mine from the age of 14 died in there with his entire family. For me, music was always going to be an extension of that intensely political experience, and I was always going to try and achieve impossibilities through the music, because we have quite a narrow parameter of political possibility in England, obviously being the state that occupied over 14 million square miles of the planet and dominated so many people's reality. There's quite a gap between what England does in the world, even in Ireland, for example, which is the laboratory of British imperialism and colonialism. A lot of what was done in Palestine was exported from Ireland first by the British during the Mandate period. So for all of those reasons, music became a tool through which to bridge that gap and achieve the things which the political system did not allow the space to achieve. So in that way, it was kind of an antidote to that particular reality.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next, because your lyrics are well-founded on deep knowledge of the causes of the world's malaise: neoliberalism, colonialism, systemic racism. I mean, do you seek to liberate by educating, and first educating yourself and then educating the others?
I would hope so, absolutely. Of course, you know, while the internet has kind of constructed for us a very sophisticated goldfish bowl in which much of our activity is now freely available. You know, people can purchase our personal details of our life from our electronic devices off the internet. They can gain access to almost any aspect of communication that happens through these devices. At the same time, we have an access to information which humanity has never really had before. And so I think specifically when dealing with the machinations of the Israel lobby in England, for example, there's a lot of information which one can access, but I think there's a way in which true investigative journalism is discouraged on quite a broad level in English society and in the United States also. You know, there's far more journalism which is merely the repeating of press releases given by institutions of government. So, for instance, defense correspondents are regularly just reading out press releases given to them by either the DoD in the US or the Ministry of Defense in Britain. So while we have tools for investigative journalism, we don't have a lot of use of those tools. And so for me, a key sort of turning point has been being able to harness some of these tools that are there, especially the open source stuff, which is in the public domain, and investigating some of these organizations who have political objectives and are pursuing those political objectives in numerous ways within the society that I live in.
Right. Your album Soundtrack to the Struggle, versions 1 and 2, include Long Live Palestine, How Does the Palestinian Struggle and Resistance Embody the Greater Fight Against Injustice in the World, and really what prompted you to write this song?
Well, as Jamal, you will well know that previous to the invention of the State of Israel, you had a train line built by the Ottomans, which went from Mosul to Haifa to Damascus to Baghdad to, you know, and my family were among the families that were able to go to Ramallah, for example. You know, they were fortunate enough to be able to do that at one point. Iraqis and Palestinians have a special connection, which is also forged in the Iraqi army being the biggest army in 1948. Again, there was the problem of misleadership. But today, if you talk to Palestinians, they will tell you about the graveyard in Jenin or in Askar in Nablus of Iraqi soldiers. They'll tell you about the siege of Fallujah and the Iraqi attempt to help the Egyptian forces there. So Iraq always had a special kind of relationship with Palestine. There's members of my family, my brother-in-law is a Palestinian from Lebanon. This is fourth generation Palestinian refugee. We've had extended members of our family have always been Palestinian. So we've had this relationship. And it's something that I grew up with in the home of this injustice being something that also deeply affected and on some level traumatized us too. So I would say that on a personal level kind of pushed me towards things, but then the context of the society I grew up in, in 2008, 2009 with Operation Cast Lead, when Israel killed over 1,400 Palestinians in Gaza, you saw the area that I am from mobilize heavily in support of the Palestinians. Many of those young people were attacked by police and beaten up, and many of them were jailed for protesting outside the Israeli embassy. And in fact, the head of the CPS at that time, the Crown Prosecution Service, is the current leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. So he prosecuted a lot of people from my community during that period. So these things more and more showed me that there was, on one hand, a great groundswell of support, of passion, of emotion linked to the Palestinian cause amongst all Arabs and all Muslims, actually. And as you rightly pointed out, all people that consider themselves to be post-colonial or emerging from colonial rule, which is actually a majority of humanity. When we think about the idea of decolonization being enshrined at the United Nations as a positive process, there are numerous political elites even in the world who have come out of the shadow of colonial domination, who see within them, within Palestinians, a brethren and sistren who have been trapped in the sands of time, as it were, who have been trapped in something of yesteryear, which is foreign colonial domination. So, as you pointed out, through the specific, you can see the general, you can see the way in which infrastructures of domination around technology, around mythologies, around race, around the what would they say? They could say jettisoning the idea of a religion into a race can then lead to this exclusion of people upon this basis, and has been practiced in different contexts and in different ways and in different places. And we also have to remember that, when the British intelligence services consult the Israeli intelligence services on numerous things. Israel went from inheriting a new laboratory for Britain's colonial methods. So we look at the destruction of homes as a punitive measure. This was the British that did this first during the 36 revolution, Palestinian revolution. And Israel adopted it. The use of human shields, it was the British that used Palestinians as minesweepers before the Israelis inherit all of these methods, innovate upon these methods, build and construct new methods with new technologies, and then that is exported back into other sort of colonial metropoles like London and Washington. So it's really through the particular that you can have an understanding of the general.
What was your experience when you visited the Palestinian refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza?
Well, I mean, all of those experiences were different. Obviously, it's normal that somebody of my background would be stopped and detained and interrogated. The level of intelligence that they had was probably more than is usual. It is my belief that certain measures were taken during my interrogation and detention by the Israelis that were then aimed to affect my ability to travel elsewhere. So following that experience, I was then unable to travel to the United States. As far as I understand, I still am unable to travel to the United States. I then was detained several times traveling into Britain. I believe that certain updates were made to my file, which were probably untrue based on the indications I received from my interrogators within 48 Palestine. So in terms of getting into Gaza, for example, getting through the sort of Egyptian, this was during the time of Hosni Mubarak. I went on the Viva Palestina convoy. You know, it's inspiring to see people holding strong to their idea of who they are, to their clarity about where they stand, to their love for one another, to their ability to still be open, still be welcoming, despite the quite sophisticated conspiracy against Palestinian life, which seems senseless so much of the time. So all of that was inspiring and gave me elements that I thought would be good to apply in my own life in terms of ways to behave, in terms of ways to treat people, in terms of ways to think of others. So yeah, it was definitely يعني بالعربي يقولون قمة المرارة وقمة الحلاوة بنفس الوقت يعني. That's what that experience was like for sure. You know, the height of bitterness and the height of sweetness.
Yes. Your work addresses many forms of inequity and suffering. The Britain-Israel Communications and Research Center would have us believe that your sole intent is to sully Israel. Tell us about their recent attempt to scrub you from Spotify.
I mean, I'm happy to sully Israel. Israel sullies itself. What I would say about BICOM is this is the largest Israel lobby group. In England, it mainly focuses on lobbying news organizations like the BBC. This is an organization that has had several key journalists within it from the BBC. For instance, one of its first directors was a gentleman by the name of Mark Berg, who went from working for the BBC to working for BICOM, then back to working for the BBC. It was founded by a gentleman by the name of Pojo Zabludovic, who his wealth came from his father's arms company, Soltam Systems, which was later subsumed into Elbit Systems, which is an arms company which I've been part of the Palestine Action Campaign against Elbit Systems in this country. We've driven Elbit out of 2 of their bases in this country. They shut down permanently their headquarters in London, thanks to our campaign. And they also sold a subsidiary at a loss in Oldham, thanks to our campaign. But, you know, that's one aspect. The BICOM pushed through its project, We Believe in Israel, which was founded by Luke Akehurst, who's a political consultant to several arms companies. We Believe in Israel have aimed at taking my music off of Spotify on the basis that it's tantamount to incitement. Now, this issue of incitement is quite important because in the Palestinian context, there are 15 journalists currently in Israeli dungeons now on the accusation of incitement. You've seen children arrested for things they've posted on social media on the accusation of incitement. You've seen a poet like Darin Tator imprisoned for posting a poem onto Facebook, Qawim ya Sha'bi Qawimhum, that Israel decided was tantamount to incitement. So it's regularly used as an excuse to shut down speech, which the Israeli government does not like. So it's interesting because this is the first application that I know of in England, but it probably wouldn't be the last. Thus far, they've not been successful, though I'm sure they're still trying. The other elements of the Israel lobby here, like the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which shares a director with the JNF, which is the largest land-owning body within 48 Palestine. It builds settlements, it ethnically cleanses Palestinians from their land. So one of the directors of that organization is the director of an organization here called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. The JNF also funds the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. they've been particularly animated in shutting me down in universities, in the trade unions, for example. They've been able to lobby some of the trade unions to no platform me. You have other aspects of the Israel lobby, like the CST, which has a little bit more mainstream legitimacy. It gets £14 million per year from the British government. Of course, Anthony Lehrman of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, who formerly was a part of the CST, has asserted that the CST has employees trained by Israeli intelligence services. The CST has regularly published things about me which are, to my mind, defamatory. And then you have other groups like the Conservative Friends of Israel, you have Labour Against Anti-Semitism. There's a whole universe of Israel lobby groups here who are well-funded and who are relentlessly militating against those who assert clearly the sanctity of Palestinian humanhood and the aversion to Israel's colonial domination of Palestinian land.
As you named some of these groups, of course, they've pressured venues, universities in the UK to invite you from speaking and performing. One example is the incident at the National Union of Students. You described this as the Israel lobby scoring their own goal. What did you mean by this?
Well, the reference to the Israel lobby scoring an own goal was mainly towards the Spotify campaign, because the Spotify campaign was a lot harder. It was a terrain that was more difficult for them, because We Believe in Israel which spearheaded the Spotify campaign, is clearly an Israel lobby group. The university campaign, so National Union of Students, was actually their most successful terrain in terms of where they've engaged me. And that's largely because a lot of what they did at that time was pushed through Parliament on one hand. So they mentioned my name several times in British Parliament in 1 week, but also they had the Union of Jewish Students, which as an organization is led by someone called Aria Miller, who's a former employee of the Israeli embassy. The Union of Jewish Students also has boasted of a productive working relationship with the Israeli embassy. It has several programs, unfortunately, which direct its members directly into the Israeli military of occupation. I'm happy to expand on that point if required by anyone listening to this who would like to contest whether the Union of Jewish Students actually does have programs that do that. It does. And also it's been claimed by former presidential candidates within the Union of Jewish Students that's actually funded by the Israeli embassy. So the problem is that in wider society, the notion that a student group is being controlled by a particular foreign embassy is a little bit more difficult for a very, frankly, well-trained English society to accept. So that's why the Union of Jewish Students is really the strongest line of attack, because it then becomes about you supposedly bullying students of a particular religion, which is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a union linked to a state with particular political objectives, and of those political objectives are silencing people such as myself, and then through the silencing of me, using that as an instrument to harm the National Union of Students, which now you've seen the elected president who had a pro-Palestinian position has now been suspended from the National Union of Students following a smear campaign, which then led to an investigation led by a particular QC, Rebecca Tuck, who has some quite interesting stated positions on the issue in which she is investigating, which I'm not a lawyer, but I understand could harm the neutrality of her investigation. And that investigation has now led to Shema, the president of the NUS, the democratically elected president of the NUS, having to step down.
I don't know a lot about.
She'd have to be suspended. Sorry, she's been suspended. Yeah,
right. I don't know about the sentiments in Britain, but I know right here in the United States they have this similar attempts to muzzle artists, academics, shut them down from speaking anything about Israel on campuses, but they have been losing. So my question to you: are the students, and for that matter, academics, aware of these attempts of the Israeli lobby, and in that case, in your case, also the involvement of the Israeli embassy. I think they're smarter than what they put out there, as we call Israeli Hasbara.
Well, I think that in the United States, it's interesting because the universities are less subject to, as far as my shallow and superficial understanding of it is, in the United States, the universities have a bit more power. They are less subject to rulings of government in the same way that universities in England still are. So obviously, this is part of the whole neoliberal push, but it has a double-edged sword in that what the double-pronged attack in universities is you'll have the Union of Jewish Students say something about a particular guest at a university, but then that will then be mirrored in Parliament by somebody like Robert Halfon, formerly the political director of the Conservative Friends of Israel, who regularly, and things that they say in Parliament are not legally actionable. So he was essentially free to call me a racist in British Parliament in a way that he couldn't have outside of British Parliament. But then here's the interesting thing. The media will then report what he said. So what you have is Parliament basically being used as a subterfuge to create a narrative, because Parliament is not a place where I can sue someone.
Right.
So you have the UJS on one side, but then you have the Parliament moving lock in step, and then it sort of creating in tandem with the media, in which you have several key figures. So for instance, the city editor at the Daily Mail newspaper, one of the most read newspapers in the country, millions of people read it every day, is a gentleman by the name of Alex Brummer. Now, Alex Brummer is not only one of the Board of Deputies, which is a key Israel lobby group here, which has said in its own trustees report in 2020 that has a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy and strengthened links with the IDF and with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. In addition to that, he heads an organization called Abraham Initiative, which is funded directly by the Israeli Ministry of Justice. Now, he's the city editor of the Daily Mail. This is clearly a conflict of interest. You have numerous other conflicts of interest throughout the British media of figures linked to Israel lobby groups. So what happens is you create this sort of nexus where truth is manufactured, which says very clearly that Jamal or Kareem Lowkey is this. This definition then is then sent to institutions at universities and used as evidence to back up the assertion. And so then it makes it quite difficult for universities when being attacked from several directions, having the stuff in the media, the stuff in Parliament, and student groups in their own university. This is now the new idea of what actually is happening. Therefore, you may not be an irrational person driven by a hatred of other people, but the story is plausible because it's being said by so many people at the same time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this conflict of interest, we've seen it here with, unfortunately, with U.S. journalists. We've had at least a couple of bureau chiefs in Jerusalem for the New York Times whose either children or family members served in the Israeli occupation army. I'm moving on to your career and your success, your enormous success, I would say, topping the charts in 2012 as 14 on the UK's download chart, 6 in rhythm and blues. You were peaking as an artist, and then you took a hiatus. Why?
So at that time, for me, I was involved in the student movement in 2010. Along that period of time, a close friend of mine by the name of Jody McIntyre, who suffers from cerebral palsy, was assaulted by police on camera. Now, he actually won compensation for that. Following on from that, I got into an altercation with the police and was then arrested. And so throughout the largest level of success that I had as an artist, I was going in and out of court, actually, for that case. Now, the case concluded before I stopped making music, But through going through that and going through the ups and downs of the music at the same time, I came to a conclusion that I needed to strengthen my knowledge. And I felt that sometimes having this place to speak to, in some cases, even millions of people, you do have a responsibility to make sure that what you're saying has some, basis in reality, in fact. And in many ways it did, but I think in some ways I was naive. So at that point, I went and got a master's. I qualified as a teacher of English. I qualified as a personal trainer. I also was part of an organization called London to Calais, which we were at that time organizing convoys and coordinating with law firms in bringing people from Calais who were, and this leads on to this issue of the refugee crisis. These were people who at that time, Britain was part of the European Union. So according to the Dubs Amendment in EU law, those were people that could be brought to Britain and claim for asylum in Britain because they had first degree relatives in Britain, even though they were in another EU country. So working on that, politically organizing in a different way. And then you see the emergence of Jeremy Corbyn. Now, the combination of things where I was looking at the work I was doing on London to Calais stuff, and I thought, this is crazy. You have thousands of people that want to hear what you have to say about something. You're working in this very micro way, but you actually have the ability to assert some type of agency on a macro level, start making music again. So I started making music again. And we then went on tour and stuff like that. And the politics was still present, but not present in the way it was when I wasn't making music.
Then you returned in 2016 with Ahmed. A very moving and painful video about the burgeoning refugee crisis and Europe's near apathy to the victims. Was this something you need to return to speak out about?
Absolutely, because at that time I had seen the way in which the vertical solidarity and horizontal hate within English society had become so prevalent. Refugees in England are only 0.18% of the population. If they do have access to public funds, it's something like £37.50 a week. There's over 1 million people that have no recourse to public funds. You compare that in terms of quote unquote a burden on the public to somebody like Rupert Murdoch, who owns News Corp and who is responsible for the Sun newspaper, Sky News Channel, literally owns the sun and the sky in the way that he imagines it to be. And the type of vitriol and horrific stereotypes that are produced about refugees in his newspapers, the idea of scarcity, the idea that these people are taking something from you, he's very successfully peddled that. But according to the Washington Post, this is somebody who, through News Corp, they hide their profits through a complex web of tax havens. According to the Guardian newspaper, he did not pay any corporate tax in this country for 11 years. Now, this is somebody who has huge power within English society to dominate the way that people think, particularly the way that people think about refugees. So in the face of that, I saw it as it would be a rather silly move to stay working in this very micro way rather than actually use the voice that I'd built and come out and speak in that way. And so I did. And then that coincided, as I say, with the emergence of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. Obviously, Corbyn had been a backbencher for many years. The Labour Party is a deeply violent, imperialist, pro-Israel party, key player in the neoliberalization of the British economy, in the privatization of key sectors within English life. But Jeremy Corbyn provided a different possibility. And
Right.
Many of us, I never joined the party, I never will, but I supported him and I supported the party at that time. I was able to mobilize people locally in my community to support him and the party. I was able to try and push for him to win, and we in 2017 were 2,000 votes off of winning. The community that I'm from is Latimer or Labrador in North Kensington. Kensington itself is one of the richest boroughs in the world, but the part of Kensington that I live in has a 25-year difference in life expectancy from the south part of the borough. So it's one of the poorest parts of the country. Now, we were able to win for the Labour Party in our borough, which had never happened before.
Wow.
Just by the strength of our part of the borough mobilizing in line with the Corbyn project. And of course, we saw a multitude of intelligence agencies work to stop what Corbyn was doing, including the British one. And so this is something that we have been witness to. We've been witness to another subversion of a better future by powerful forces who do a lot to obscure their own influence in society.
You've expanded your reach with the podcast, The Watchdog, which you started in the summer of 2021. This platform allows you to dig deeper into one issue. Tell me about it.
Well, The Watchdog is a podcast that I've been very fortunate to carry out with Mint Press. I've been able to interview people from Noam Chomsky to, recently Ariel Corin, who just resigned from Google because of the punishment of pro-Palestinian workers within Google. I was able to interview her, been able to interview some really interesting people from all different walks of life in different places. And yeah, as you say, it gives me a good opportunity to expand some of these ideas, to dig deeper, and also to have a sort of platform to show some of the investigative work that I also do.
Can we look forward to some new amazing Lowkey rap releases?
Yes, hopefully there is some stuff in the works. I can't pretend that this campaign hasn't slowed down the music side of what I do. It has. It does make it harder to make music in a self-sufficient way. Media seems to be a slightly safer place in some ways, in terms of I'm an independent artist. I've always been an independent artist. So what that means is that I invest money in music and there kind of has to be a return. Whereas with media, the return is in people's ideas. The return is not necessarily a direct transaction. So their limiting of my ability to reach people as a musician has made it less likely that the investment will take place to make another, big album. But we'll try.
Well, it's a pleasure talking to you. Kareem Dennis, Lowkey, you can find his music all over Spotify, iTunes, go to YouTube, you have a website?
I do not know. I do not.
Well, anyway, it's out there, it's powerful, it's inspirational. Make sure, you listen to his music and hopefully we'll have you soon on Arab Talk.
I would love that. Thank you very much.
Wow, that's the voice and the face of Lowkey, Kareem Dennis, international, basically music superstar, Jamal. There's no other way to look at it. The interview was really fascinating. And I think, as you said at the beginning, his command of international social justice issues is really impressive. I mean, this individual has a command of international political events, unlike many people that we've interviewed in the spectrum of music and cultural affairs. He's a sophisticated individual, has a deep command of political and social justice issues all over the world, and has committed himself to integrating that with his art, his music, and his rapping. He's a remarkable individual, Jamal.
You're absolutely right, Jess. Moving on to the news of the day, news that we've actually said it from day one. Israel murdered Shireen Abu Akleh.
Absolutely, they did.
And we
What took them
said,
so long?
and
Yeah.
we said they were going to deny it, which they
Which they
did.
did.
Deny. We said that they, along with their surrogates right here in the United States, are going to deflect, make excuses, try to tarnish her reputation, try to say she's in the wrong place, try to blame it on Palestinians killing her, all kinds of things. But thankfully, and I say thankfully kind of lightly, to tell you the truth, and that's because of the pressure of
Right.
worldwide pressure and Palestinian American pressure and her family's pressure on the State Department to keep pushing the Israelis to investigate. Now, finally, the news, we're getting it from the Israeli occupation forces. They have admitted for the first time, and this is their language, that there is, look, they they don't have the decency to apologize and say,
or to come clean. They won't come clean.
They say that there is a high possibility Palestinian American Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was shot and killed by Israeli fire while covering an Israeli military operation in Jenin in May. That's their announcement. I mean, when they say, they don't say this, by the way, they don't say this at all. High possibility. I tell you one thing, Jess, they knew from day one, not only that they killed her, who shot her, the name of the soldier, his rank, what type of rifle he used, what type of bullet killed her. They knew that from day one, and they kept denying it. And had it not for the international pressure, they would not have come to this admission.
Well, I would say if not for the courage of her family, Jamal, that Shireen's family has been dogged in their pressuring Anthony Blinken. They came to the United States, although they didn't meet with President Biden, and they should have, by the way. They marshaled an international campaign to bring attention to her murder by the apartheid state, by the Israeli military. And you're absolutely right. They knew about it. They knew about it from the moment it happened. It's a very weak statement, but I guess for an apartheid murderous military regime, it's a step. My question for you, and we'll continue to follow this story, what will be the repercussions of them admitting that they murdered the journalist? What will happen? Will the United States take any action, because they did in fact murder an American citizen? Will there be any accountability above just admitting that they did this? What will the next step look like, Jamal?
My prediction, nothing will happen from the United States end, because if the US was so concerned outside that pressure, the first thing they should have done, our politicians should have done, is froze military aid to Israel. That's kind of the minimum step that you'll take when your military funding and weapons were used to kill innocent people like children, like civilians, like journalists, like medics, which Israel has the habit to do. And they haven't done that. They haven't done it with the elderly Palestinian American who was also killed by the Israelis. They bound him and tied him to the ground, let him basically freeze to death and die. And they just got a minor slap on the list, so I don't expect them to do anything beyond this. And it's really criminal. It's criminal, of course. We know the Israeli criminal on their side, and criminal on the politicians who keep signing that blank check to Israel every year, knowingly that Israel has been certified as an apartheid state, knowingly that Israel has killed children, has killed journalists, has killed medics, and it's just going to go on. It's really, now I tell you one thing. It's now they are in the Hasbara scenario. How can they spin this to minimize it? Because, like as I said earlier, deny, deflect, and now basically go into the Hasbara or Israeli propaganda mode with their surrogates right here in the US to say, this was accidental. She was at the wrong place in the wrong time. All these all these crazy scenarios they'll try to cook for you. But my question to all these Hasbara trolls that who have been lying since her death, what are they going to do now since Israel has admitted that they killed? Because before they were saying no, Palestinians killed her. Are they going to bury their heads in the sand?
Yeah, and this is my theory. I mean, of course, I'm always interested in the timing of these announcements, Jamal. This announcement came out on a very, from a news standpoint, a very interesting point. It's in the middle of a holiday weekend that they made this announcement. There's a lot of other news going on in the United States and globally right now. I mean, we don't have time to go into it, whether it's the war in Ukraine or a new prime minister in the UK or flooding and global warming. I mean, the timing of them announcing this statement is going to get buried. So my prediction is that they announce it and they're not going to say anything. They're going to hope that people's memories for this will be very short. We will not forget this. We are going to continue to
look
cover
how disgusting their statement is, and I want to quote from the statement, and this is from the Israeli military. It appears that it's not possible to unequivocally determine the source of the gunfire which hit and killed Miss Abu Akleh. However, there is a high possibility that Miss Abu Akleh was accidentally hit by IDF gunfire fired towards suspects identified as armed Palestinian gunmen during an exchange of fire.
See, there's all lies. It's all lies. There was no gunfire going on. There were no Palestinians in the vicinity. That's complete, unequivocal BS, as we know. So yeah, I predict that they will just bury their head in the sand. So I have one quick question for you, Jamal. Next time you and I go to visit Palestine, are you ready to declare your love interests? I guess I have to declare who I'm having any kind of romantic relationship with next time I go to Palestine. Who does this, Jamal? Let me ask you, who does this? Not even the most rogue states, the most rogue states in this world ask you to declare your love interests. Nobody.
I have to admit, they're getting creative in exposing themselves
yes,
as an apartheid regime, as a ridiculous regime. We haven't finished talking about them raiding Palestinian civil society organizations and shutting them down.
Exactly.
And we haven't finished talking about them, how they try to blame the civil society organizations as terror group. In other words, basically they're saying all Palestinians are terrorists. So they try to be creative. First the harassment at the airport when foreigners or of Palestinian descent, or even who sympathize with Palestinians, get harassed all the time at the airport and at the crossings from Jordan at the bridges, and all the tactics that they use to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. If a Palestinian from Jerusalem marries someone, let's say from Nablus, she or he cannot live with his or her spouse in Jerusalem. And now foreigners must tell the Israeli Defense Ministry if they fall in love with a Palestinian in the occupied West Bank, according to the new rules. You can't make this, put the expletive here, you can't make it up, Jess. I mean...
Well, it's bizarre. It's, again, another example of the apartheid state, of the Israelis overplaying their oppressive hand. I did read that there's a temporary stay on this order, but I think if we look at it from the larger perspective, Jamal, as you said, not only are they getting creative, they leave themselves open to international condemnation yet again. So I wonder if...
Just want to clarify, this order just is part of a whole big thing.
Right.
I mean, this is the newest of this. Just to give an example, the new restrictions that they came up with on, for example, Palestinian universities include a quota of 150 student visas and 100 foreign lecturers. That's a total. Well, there is no such limits on Israeli universities. So you're limited. You cannot have basically foreign students coming into the country or foreign lecturers coming into the country. Then business people and aid organizations also have limited visas on people coming to work for them.
Well, here's the question I have, Jamal. I love everybody when I go to Palestine. My list of when I'm going to disclose my love interests when I go there, my romantic interests, it's going to be a very long list.
It is crazy. Again, wake up and smell the coffee.
Wake up and smell. Wake up and smell the apartheid, Jamal. That's what
I mean, what we have here.
Is the State Department going to say anything about this?
I don't think so. I mean, this is a ridiculous thing about it. This is we have a one state between, let's think about the facts on the ground, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and you have two systems. That's it.
That's what apartheid is.
That's the simple definition. By the way, this is this whole thing, like I said, it's a 97-page GOGAT. That GOGAT is
right.
The unit that organization basically administers everything in the West Bank, Israeli unit. This is basically, it's called the title, Procedure for Entry and Residence of Foreigners in Judea and Samaria, that the name Israel uses for the West Bank. So it's not one item. This is the latest item that they have to come and be creative. They just have to be creative, basically, to
well, the EU has
make
already,
life hell for Palestinians.
Right. I know that the EU has condemned this already, but I'm just waiting to see what the United States, what a State Department will say about this blatantly racist, oppressive strategy. And what will academics do, Jamal? This is an attack on academic freedom yet again.
Well, there is an academic boycott of Israeli universities,
and they wonder, but they wonder why there's an academic boycott of Israeli institutions.
Exactly.
They wonder why.
And going to your first question, nothing will happen. Nothing will happen, including the EU's condemnation. If the EU and EU separate countries like Germany and others keep funding Israeli apartheid and giving them money, when we talk about American taxpayers are forced to dole out $3.8 billion every year to Israel in military aid to replenish their supplies of the rockets and weapons that they drop on Palestinians. If you don't take this action, the few congressmen and congresswomen who call for such an action, the minimum the United States has to do is to freeze.
Absolutely.
To freeze funding this apartheid regime, to freeze shipping weapons to this apartheid regime, and ask them, what are you going to do to improve really now? What are you going to do to end your apartheid practices? Not just by condemning it or making some silly statement, that we are accustomed, unfortunately, to hear.
Yeah, it's a remarkable extension of their oppressive practices. We're going to continue to follow this and look at the consequences, but we won't stop from holding this oppressive apartheid regime accountable. We're going to continue to talk about it.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.